He or she has a vote. Bring him David, is that a large one?
Very welcome to St. Michael's Theatre. Could I ask you to settle down and take your seats, please? I'd like to welcome you all here and welcome our distinguished panel and David Davenport, who's very topical session of the Summer School Performing Irish College. I'm welcoming you to the Kennedy Summer School, but I'd first of all like to mention the three remaining events that are happening today. At 3 o'clock we have a very interesting film by David Harvey called The Kennedy's Irish Mafia. It's going to tell the story of the Irish Americans who were supporting the Kennedys in the 60s. And then at 5 o'clock we have George Hook and Michael Graham going head-to-head in a debate which is entitled Ireland is deluding himself in its love affair with America, and that's going to be refereed by Nora Rowan. Don't envy her that task. Then at 7 o'clock, the Army Band are coming to play such a prominent role in the 50th anniversary celebration on the 22nd of June. The Army Band are coming to New Ross to give a recital at our new iconic Emerald Flame open-air recital, and I'd ask all the people in the town and all of you to come down there. It should be a very special recital by the Army Band, and you'll be very welcome to the town. And then our closing tonight is the Kennedy's Homecoming, which is a behind-the-scenes documentary on all the preparations prior to that wonderful event on the 22nd of June that brought 25,000 people to the quayside in New Ross and over 30 members of the Kennedy family to what I called last night the gathering of the year and the year of the gathering. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to our moderator for this session, David Davenport.
Thank you very much. Format this afternoon we will have presentations from each of our protagonists here. We have Richard Bruton, the John Minister, and Pierce Doherty of Sinn Féin, both putting the case for the abolition of the Shannon. Both of them, of course, guilty secrets, dark pasts. They were both members of the Shannons themselves. We have, on the other side of the argument, the distinguished educationalist and human rights activist, Senator Catherine Zappone, and we have Micheál Martin, leader of Fianna Fáil, his head still spinning, no doubt, after what Jerry Adams described as an opportunistic U-turn of the Shannon campaign. And to sum up, we will have Jane Souter, who needs no introduction, as a political scientist in DCU and former journalist. So perhaps I might ask you first, Richard, to make the case for the proposal being put forward by the government.
Thanks very much, David. And sorry, it's hard to see you in the spotlight, but thank you very much for the invitation. Noel, particularly, I know, and I really welcome the opportunity. I know the Trust here is doing great work promoting the area and also promoting debate in this manner. The case that I would make very strongly is that politics has to change in this crisis. Everyone reflecting on the last number of years would agree that politics failed to protect citizens at a time of enormous crisis. Politics must change so that we adapt and learn the lessons of that. But politics must also change to show that it is willing to adapt, like every family, like every business is having to do in the course of this huge crisis that we are confronting. And at the root of the case we are making is that if you look across the world at other countries of our size, virtually all of them have just one chamber, have parliaments that operate with just one chamber. We can provide a very effective system of legislative scrutiny and delivery through the chamber, the Dáil, which is elected by all the people. We do not need a chamber which is elected, in this instance, by only 1% of the population participated in its election on this occasion. In that process, we can reduce the number of politicians that we have by 30%, we can save 20 million that have alternative uses, and we can deliver more effective governance. So just to put it in context, abolition is part of a set of sweeping changes that we campaigned for as a party, as indeed did Labour, in the last general election. And at the heart of that, one of our key 5 political commitments was in relation to reform of politics, and at the heart of that was the abolition of the Senate. So this is something we pledged we would put to the people, and now we are doing it. But it's in the context of a sweeping range of political changes that are occurring. We ended corporate donations. We've established an independent fiscal council to oversee budgetary strategy so that we can't have the reckless budgets that we saw in the past. We've introduced powers of Dáil inquiry so that the Dáil can investigate things which has been robbed of. We've restored freedom of information so there can be greater examination of what government is at. We've improved regulation in many areas. Lobbyists, whistleblower legislation, strengthened ombudsman, standards in public office, and so on. So there is a very strong agenda of reform that is occurring that was part of the change we pledged to introduce. I believe that the case for the abolition of the Senate is compelling. If you look at how it is put in there, as I say, it's elected by just 1%, but to go beneath that, you have a situation where it's all based on patronage and privilege. Patronage in that the Taoiseach of the day appoints 11 people, just simply appoints them. Not a contest, not a selection. The next 43 seats are selected by councillors, and all of these have been based, they're all card-carrying party members within the party system. So you have councillors and politicians picking their own, and not surprisingly, as Michael McDowell once described it, has become a creche for politicians who aspire to grow and a retirement home for others who are at the end of their period. You also look at best practice in other countries, and you see that countries like Sweden, like Denmark, New Zealand, they have reformed their systems to move away from second chambers that were rooted in privilege of the past and to reform their chamber, to have a one-chamber democracy. So that is international best practice. You look at whether the Senate has been effective as a watchdog, as some would say is its role. The truth is that the last time the Senate used its major power, which is to delay a piece of legislation, was in 1964. So a watchdog that only barks once in every 50 years is not a particularly effective watchdog. I think it is the Dáil Chamber, which is elected by all of our people, is the place where we need to create an effective citizens-based parliamentary democracy. And that is the purpose of the Dáil reforms that we are implementing. We need, in the course of legislation, to engage people at the very start of its design. And that is what we will have. Hearings at the start of the legislative process, bringing in citizens, bringing in necessary expertise and experience to help the deputies elected by all the people to shape that legislation. That's profoundly different from what now happens. So what we are, to give you an example of what it's like, we are bringing, if you like, the architectural plans in for debate and redesign in the Dáil with citizens involved, instead of bringing in a house that's almost built and saying, well, what do you think of this, when people have very little option or opportunity to change. That's the sort of change we're bringing about. We're also, something, and I've been in economics, I suppose, for most of my life, I could never understand how we had a system of scrutinizing of spending half the year after the money is already spent. We don't scrutinize in the Dáil. The estimates process is completely dysfunctional. We examine the money after most of it is committed. Now we will introduce our budget in October, and there will be scrutiny before any money is committed, giving the Dáil much more power to shape change. We're bringing new procedures into the legislative process. The hearings at the start, a reflection period before you finally press the button to enact, and a review 12 months on. So the whole legislative process will be much more open and to the role of citizens and the role of deputies. We're going to bring in a much stronger committee system, with the opposition having more chairs as of right, so that it's not at the give and beckon and call of the government, and to strengthen their power to scrutinise. So I believe, in summary, we are faced with situations where everyone in our community is having to make changes. They're having to look at what parts of our system are important and effective. And that's what has to be done in politics. I think anyone looking at the role of the Senate, it conflicts with best international practice. It has been based on privilege and on patronage. It's not effective as a watchdog, and it can deliver real savings, 20 million, which can be applied to other purposes that have real value to our people. 20 million could, for example, fund 350 primary teachers. It can fund many other things. But just like we are rationalising many activities in government, merging councils, rationalising hospitals and so on, it is to free up money to provide resources to the frontline services that we need. And politics should not be exempt from that demand to rationalise, build what is effective, engage in new activities, and discard what is no longer needed or justified. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Now, I'd call on Micheál Martin to rebut the argument that the Seanad is effectively dysfunctional, unrepresentative and difficult. Micheál Martin, the leader of the Dáil.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organising committee for the invitation to be with you this afternoon to debate this very important issue facing the Irish people. And the referendum has not just only started the referendum debate, but I think the issues and the core issues are now becoming very, very clear to the people. This is the only constitutional change to our political system which the government is currently planning to propose. It is at the heart of what they have repeatedly claimed to be a democratic revolution. And if the referendum is passed, ministers will hang out the mission accomplished banners and they will spend more time praising themselves. However, what they won't have done or achieved is to change a single significant element of the political system which has failed us in the past. A yes vote is a vote to keep Parliament completely subservient to ministerial control. It is a vote to reduce the scrutiny of legislation, to reduce the opportunities to question ministers, and to end the chance of real reform in this country. The government is proposing to make over 40 amendments to our constitution, but has not been able to find a single power of government which should be amended. The referendum's passage would leave Ireland with a political system unique in the modern world, by combining a single House of Parliament with a weak local government system and complete ministerial control over the entire system. This referendum is about a government which wants to talk about reform, but to actually gather more and more power into the hands of ministers. They are spending over 14 million euros to hold this vote. And it's extremely disingenuous to say that by passing it, will somehow free up money for 350 teachers and assistants. If they were genuine about that, they could have had the referendum next year and keep that 14 million for public services this year. And I admit teachers and SNAs and so on who are complaining about the pressure that's on them in terms of the taking away of funding from public services. And that cannot hide the fact that its passage of the referendum would not reduce by 1 cent the spending cuts and tax increases of this government. Because of course the Seanad will continue right up to 215, 216. It will not reinstate special needs assistance and respite care grants and home health hours and so on that have all been cut to date. So this is a very cynical and very negative referendum campaign. It's targeting individuals and personalities, attacking opponents personally, and I think a relentless spinning within the media itself. And I think it's also very cynical of the Taoiseach, to threaten the people, essentially, by saying, like he did on Thursday last, that the reform of the Oireachtas committees will only occur if the Seanad was abolished. If he was, and if his government was serious about reform, the changes should go ahead anyway. They're not dependent on the passage of this referendum. And now one of the government reform measures requires ministers to spend more time answering questions and being more accountable to the Dáil. And trying to get rid of the Seanad, in my view, is the ultimate power grab by a government that has the biggest majority in the history of the state. And the decision not to allow the people to vote on reforming the Seanad and the Dáil, I think is the most cynical decision of all. People are not being given a choice. And that's based on the simple fact, of course, that there's not a single person in this campaign who is advocating the retention of the Seanad as it is. The clear majority of government TDs who spoke during the Dáil debate said that they wanted reform, not abolition. By trying to make this a referendum about retaining the Seanad as it is, Fine Gael and Labour are specifically trying to avoid having a debate about reform, and they cannot be allowed to get away with this. As part of the campaign, there's been a particular emphasis on misrepresenting what opponents have said in the past. Fine Gael makes a point of not saying that my party's position in 2011 was that the first thing Ireland required was a complete change to the workings of government and the Dáil, which would include constitutional change to their powers. The reality is that every party in the Dáil has changed its position on this issue over the years. Minister Richard Bruton himself, who unlikely started his national career as a senator, has served 32 years in the Oireachtas, and for 28 of these, he was a staunch defender of the Seanad. In the case of Sinn Féin, they both want to scrap and potentially re-establish the Seanad at the same time. And Deputy First Doherty, who was representing here on the platform, also started his career in the Oireachtas as a senator. He's abhorrence of elitism didn't seem to be too acute when he was seeking votes from the Seanad electorate. In 2011, every party agreed with the core idea that our political system had failed and required a profound change. And the core of this was to be a change in the balance of powers between different parts of the political system. And since then, the situation has actually become more tense. Even the Fine Gael whip himself has described his government's performance as, quote, deplorable. It's not just that legislation is being pushed through more aggressively than ever before. The absolute dominance of government over every aspect of the Dáil has been tightened. I'd be very worried about a single chamber. Property tax went through in 24-26 hours in the Dáil. The cost to child benefit went through with no amendment being allowed because of the guillotine. The same with the respite care grant. Very significant proposal that affected people in the last 12 months was rammed through the Dáil. And if you had a single chamber, it would get much worse, particularly in the context of a government with a huge majority. Less scrutiny, less oversight is what will occur if we abolish the Seanad itself. Routine consultation between parties, which was seen over many years, has been ended over the last 2.5 years. For example, the fiscal treaty referendum was the first time when pro-European parties in opposition were shut up from discussions about the wording of the referendum. Even more significantly, the opposition has been shut out of discussions about the operations of the Dáil itself. The package announced on Wednesday, that Richard spoke about, demonstrates this powerfully. In the name of supposedly making the government more accountable, the government actually announced a package of changes to the Dáil's operations without consulting anybody. Ministers have spent hours talking to journalists about how they are committed to being accountable to the Dáil, but couldn't find a single minute to talk to members of the Dáil before announcing the package. But the Taoiseach himself said repeatedly that there would be an all-party approach to Dáil reform, a promise which has been comprehensively broken. He gave a personal commitment to me in the Dáil about consultation with the opposition parties on reform, and unfortunately this is now added to the government's long list of broken promises. When elected, the Taoiseach talked about humility and hope, and since all we're getting is arrogance and spin. In addition, the Taoiseach has refused to take part in a debate with me on the referendum, or indeed with others. He's ducking and jiving. What is he afraid of? Why won't he debate this if it's so profound and so much at the heart of the democratic revolution? His promise about a fresh start from the failed politics of the past did not last long, and I'm repeating my request to the Taoiseach for a public debate on this issue, on the areas for the remainder of this campaign. After this package is implemented, the Dáil reform package, the situation will remain that only a member of government will be allowed to propose a change of Dáil business. Only a member of government will be allowed to get a vote on any matter which involves spending or raising money. Every political party wanted to reform the way the Oireachtas worked, so that we could learn from the mistakes of the economic crisis. But the government's entire package of changes could have been in place during the last decade, and it would have done nothing to address the core faults which contributed to the current crisis. It's not just the opposition which is the problem with what's happening. One Fine Gael backbencher recently described his role as being expected to both to turn up and shut up, unquote. If anyone is foolish enough to believe that accountability is being changed in the slightest, then you should realise that government ministers, like Minister Shadow, would be able to refuse to answer questions about why people, for example, avoid a breathalyzer test obligatory for every citizen, and other ministers likewise. The people are not being offered reform. They're being offered a further concentration of power within the existing political system. And I think that's a betrayal of what the people voted for in 2011 and betrayal of what was committed to by every political party. The alternative is to say no to this referendum proposal and demand proposals for real reform. And while the government is already known for its arrogance, it would not be arrogant enough to take a defeat and refuse to return with a reform vote. There is an alternative to what is being proposed. It is to change what our political institutions do, not just the amount of time they spend doing it. It's not about just reducing politicians. I find that an appalling, cynical play. Vote yes to reduce politicians. Imagine in some African states, an emerging democracy, if that was the clarion call from governments in such states. Vote yes to reduce democracy, to reduce politicians. It's about what politicians do we must change. It's about how the system works we must change. That's real reform. And we've made our proposals, we made over 70 specific proposals for changing the balance of power between government and the Oireachtas, and giving our national parliaments the space to be more expert and to be more effective. Proposals like opening up ministerial office to non-politicians, reforming the ministerial appointment process in the Dáil, elections for the County Court by secret ballot, reducing ministerial control over the Dáil agenda, introducing regulation orders for all proposals discussed in the Oireachtas, reforming capital procedures, and much, much more. Above all, making it much more independent from the executive. And a reformed second chamber, in our view, particularly given what's happened over the last 2.5 years, is an important part of this overall fundamental reform. And I do support the direct election of senators by the people. 50% gender quota for Shannon election. Senators from Northern Ireland to be provided for within a new Senate. And increased powers for a new reform Senate for scrutiny and particularly for enhanced European Union reform, from where emanates the bulk of legislation that affects Irish people today, and specific minority representation. That can be done, and proposals have come forward from ourselves as a political party and from independents, specifically outlining how that reform can be brought into effect. By voting no on October 4, people will confirm that they want real reform while ensuring that the government parties do not get more power and continue to make false promises on savings. Thank you very much.
Sinn Féin are in the unusual position in this referendum of actually backing the government position. And some say they have performed something of a U-turn themselves, but to put their case as their finance spokesman, a man who came to national prominence in the Shannon himself, it must be said, here's Dr.
When you carry me so taking Scott Saudi shop, I just want to correct you. We didn't support the government in relation to the way that they brought this referendum forward. We believe it should have went to the Constitutional Convention. But on the bigger issue of abolition of the Shannon, I would contest that the government actually supported Sinn Féin view, because as a senator, the sole senator of Sinn Féin in the last Senate, I was the sole voice arguing for the abolition of that chamber. Charles Haughey, Michael Lowry, Ray Burke, Liam Lawler, Bertie Ahern, Ivor Cowley. These names for many have defined how Irish public views the political system. Clearly, public confidence in the political system has taken a battering over recent decades. We've seen corruption, tribunals, and poor political leadership, and cronyism has taken its toll on the system. And the system is dominated and corrupted by privilege, paralysed by clientelism and dynasty politics, and resistant to change. When councillors accepted corrupt payments in exchange for rezoning land, they damaged politics and in particular local government. And they set the context that allowed governments to strip power from local authorities, knowing that the public trust in their local representatives had been severely undermined. When the public saw TDs such as Michael Lowry and party leaders such as Bertie Ahern before tribunals of inquiry, this damaged politics and it damaged the perception of the Dáil. When TDs drink their way through crucial Dáil votes and engage in antics such as Lapgate, it appears to the public that politicians are not taking their job seriously, even in times of crisis. And when Fianna Fáil used the Shannon to secure car parking rights and access to the Dáil Members Bar for close associates of Bertie Ahern, including their party general secretary, they reinforced the associations between the Shannon and cronyism. So the Irish voter today is highly cynical about politicians and about the political system. And that in itself impedes the ability of those of us who actually want to change Ireland for the better. If we're serious about political reform, then we have to look why so many people feel excluded and why so many people don't exercise their right to vote. We have to aim to make the institutions of the state work better for all of its citizens. And that means empowering local government. It also means reforming the Dáil. But it also means putting a brake on the seepage of sovereignty from Ireland to the EU. Power in decision-making must be transparent and it must be accountable to all citizens. And the further away from citizens that decisions are made, then the worse it is for democracy. So that's why we need to empower local government and recognise that the handing of power over to the EU is bad for citizens. Local government, in my view, should be given increased powers, and we need to look at areas of responsibility such as education, employment, housing, social services, and the ability to raise revenue. And we'd also like to see the decision taken by this government to abolish the democratically elected board of Uachtaráin Gaeltacht reversed. So Sinn Féin is committed to fundamental political reform, but the key objectives of this reform must be to restore the trust of citizens in the political system and the electoral system, to maximise the number of citizens that are participating and engaging in our political systems at all levels. And this has to include northern voting rights and voting rights for the diaspora. We have to ensure that the Dáil and local government are representative of citizens, and that in particular means increasing the number of women in elected positions, which remains very low in comparative to other states. It is clear, I think, to everybody across the state, across this island, that the Dáil needs to be reformed. TDs, and in particular the opposition parties, need to be empowered to hold the government to account. And this will have to involve change to the Dáil itself, to how the committees work, to how the Cairn Comhairle is elected, to how committee chairs are selected, and other measures also. But Sinn Féin also wants to see reform as to how the Dáil is elected. We want to see us move away from the smaller constituencies to the larger 7-seater constituencies, which was originally envisaged under the PR single transferable vote system, and allow 1/3 of the Dáil to be elected through a list system, because list systems can play an important role in increasing the diversity of those elected. But some of the most important changes that we want to see delivered will mean giving more people the right to vote. And what that means is allowing 16-year-olds the right to vote. It means implementation of a fair system of voting rights for Irish citizens abroad. And it means allowing those in the north to have northern representation in the Dáil. And I note that many people who are opposed to the abolition of the Shannon have cited northern representation for the first time, and we hear Micheál Martin just mentioned it there. And I welcome this new support for northern representation. But let me be clear, this could have been done and should have been done by the last government. Fianna Fáil, Bertie Ahern committed to northern representation in the Dáil, but Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour coalesced to stop it. So whatever the outcome of this Shannon referendum, I challenge Richard Bruton and Micheál Martin to commit publicly that they will take action to make the commitment that was given by Bertie Ahern of northern representation a reality. I've heard others, including the government parties and Fianna Fáil, set out their proposals for political reform. And what I would challenge the public to do is to judge each and every one of these parties by their actions, not by their words. Because frankly for me, it is hard to be sitting here listening to Micheál Martin set out his political reform agenda that they're supposedly going to implement if they're in government the next time round. Because I know only too well that Micheál Martin was a member of the last government, that Micheál Martin, not once, not twice, but on 3 occasions, voted to deny the people of my constituency, Donegal South West, the right to vote in a by-election, where they were left underrepresented for nearly 2 years. And he did this with his colleagues in government because of their narrow, selfish political interest to hold on to power at all costs. And it took a High Court challenge and a court order imposing a restriction or a demand of the government to hold that by-election for Micheál Martin and his colleagues to actually allow democracy to take place. We've seen the same person, the leader of Fianna Fáil, who supported Bertie Ahern through his term as Taoiseach, and saw nothing wrong with Bertie Ahern using the Shannon to reward political crony. Let's not forget, in June of 2007, when a number of senators got elected to the Dáil, Bertie Ahern nominated 4 senators for 4 weeks to the Dáil. They sat 1 day. One of them was General Secretary of Fianna Fáil. The other one was one of his Drum Contra buddies, and 2 others also. And we've seen how he's rewarded political cronies down through his 50 years. Not a peep from Micheál Martin or his colleagues during that time. So this debate is taking place just 3 weeks out from the referendum on the abolition of the Shannon. And Sinn Féin is calling for a yes vote in this referendum. We are absolutely clear that this Shannon, in its current form, needs to be abolished. For most people, the Shannon is irrelevant. They have never had a vote in the Shannon, nor has the Shannon had any impact on their daily lives. The inbuilt government majority means that the Shannon is nothing more than a rubber stamp of government decisions. And we've heard when last the government or the Shannon used its limited powers, and they did so by mistake 50 years ago next month. The Shannon represents a blatant inequality at the heart of our political system. The cronyism, the elitism, are synonymous with the Shannon that has fostered the type of politics that has made the Irish voter so cynical. The failure to reform the Shannon by consecutive governments, including Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, echoes the failure to reform the political system as a whole. There has been plenty of time, but there's been no action. The Shannon has promoted political cronies and allies rather than ideas and visions. The system of the Taoiseach nominees, particularly under the last government, has been used to promote political allies and cronies rather than anything to increase diversity into the political system. And in the main, it has been a safety net used by all parties, bar none, for those who have failed to get elected to the Dáil. And the most damning feature of the Shannon is the elitism, the inequality, and the discrimination at its core. So can there really be a place in a real republic based on equality for an elected office which only a tiny percentage of the population have a right to vote? By restricting the votes to the elite of those educated in a number of select colleges, and as well as city and county councillors, the Shannon is an anomaly in a modern democracy. It runs in the face of the core principle that all citizens are equal. It is obviously unjust to most people that a House of Parliament would discriminate against citizens based on their level of education. But that is what's happened for decades, despite each and every one of us in the past who had the opportunity to vote in the referendum in 1979 to demand that was changed. The accusation that the abolition of the Shannon will result in this government being less accountable would be a good argument if it were true, but it's not. It's a lazy argument, it's a sloppy argument by those seeking to exploit the public's justifiable anger at this government who has failed to keep up and deliver its promises. The Shannon has little power and has bothered to exercise even less. It has no role in holding the government to account. Let's be clear, don't be fooled. When I was in the Shannon, I argued that we would be allowed the right to ask questions of the minister. Fianna Fáil wouldn't allow it to happen. Parliament, you cannot hold the government to account. It's not designed for that purpose. So don't be sucked into the idea that it will result in less government accountability. We know that many people will see this referendum as an opportunity to vote against the government. And this is understandable given the broken promises, given the hardship, given the austerity, given the pain that is being heaped by this government on communities and citizens and families right across the state. But I would ask people to look at the issue before them on its merit. There is no defence that can be made to keep this Shannon in its current form. It needs to be abolished. Sinn Féin, for our part, seeks a new republic on this island based on equality for all its citizens. We want to see an end to the privilege, to the elitism, to the cronyism, and to the power of vested interests that have damaged politics so much in our country. Fairness, democracy and equality of citizenship needs to be the demand, needs to be the battle cry for all of us who seek a new Ireland. And the current Seanad has no place or part in any of that. Voting to abolish the Seanad is the right decision, and voting to secure rights that for Dáil representation, for Northern representation and the diaspora, and demanding that the Dáil is reformed is the right course of action for a new republic. For Michael.
Thank you, Pierce. I almost feel sorry for you. I hadn't realised what a dreadful ordeal it was to have to spend 4 years in such a dysfunctional institution. You seem to have served it quite well. Mind you do have a point of something I've always thought. How can it be that being a senator for a day confers parking rights for life? However, our next speaker will hopefully give us a refreshingly non-party political view of this debate. She adorns the upper house. She strikes me as epitomising the kind of person that the original senator was chosen to give a platform to, and moreover, she's the only person that has produced a bill to reform the Seanad that would not require a referendum. Senator Catherine Zaghloul.
As one who is very proud to be American Irish, as one who comes from a democratic Catholic household on the west coast of America, and as one whose childhood was marked by the ebullience and the hope of Jack Kennedy's vision and presidency, it is a great personal joy to participate in the Kennedy Summer School as it marks 50 years since the man himself set foot on this soil. I want to offer hearty congratulations to Noel Whelan for this event. Your energy, strategic intelligence, and generosity is at the success, part of the success of this summer school, and I'm pleased to participate in this debate, along with my Oireachtas colleagues, as well as James Souter, on ways to politically reform Ireland. To prepare for the debate, I took the opportunity to read President Kennedy's 1963 address to both houses of the Oireachtas. His words celebrated Ireland's achievement of establishing a republic and the solid ties between America and Ireland. And in his introductory remarks, he said, "I am deeply honored to be your guest in the free parliament of a free Ireland." 50 years on, I think it's reasonable to ask, does Ireland have a free parliament today? And what would it mean to have a free parliament as we reassess what are the most appropriate ways to govern ourselves in the 21st century? I'm aware that this is a very big question, and so I'm going to focus these remarks, as others have, on the matter of the 32nd Amendment of the Constitution being put to the Irish people in early October, just prior to a budget, wherein the government will choose whether or not to continue its policies of austerity against the backdrop of mass unemployment, widespread immigration, and countless thousands of people in negative equity, all of whom, no doubt, are not feeling very free. In his Seanad speech on the Seanad Abolition Amendment to the Constitution, the bill that's putting now the referendum to the people, the Taoiseach said, yes, it is the Constitution that declares the people are sovereign. What could be more appropriate or more democratic than asking the people to decide on the future of the Seanad? Well, indeed, as Article 6 of the Constitution reads, all powers of government are derived from the people whose right it is in the final appeal to decide on all questions of national policy. The Constitution says it is the right of the people to decide on all questions, and yet the government has flatly refused, with its absolute power of an overly dominant executive and whipped parliament, to put two relevant issues to the people. Firstly, it did not put the issue of Seanad reform before the Irish people. In independent polls of the Irish people, significant percentages have said they are in favor of Seanad reform, in spite of the fact that the government has refused them this choice. This is an instance, I think, of government denying the sovereignty of the Irish people. Furthermore, senators proposed 31 amendments to this Seanad abolition bill that would have incorporated a mandate to the government to implement Seanad reform if the Irish people rejected the abolition proposal. But all of these amendments, which are legally possible, but were ruled out of order, including ones that propose the issue of Seanad reform, would revert to the Constitutional Convention. The government flatly refused, with no rationale, to let the people have their say on reform. This is another example, I think, of the government denying the sovereignty of the Irish people. So you haven't been given the option for Shannon reform. And the people are angry with this. They're learning that the government does not consider them to be sovereign in matters of politically reforming our institutions. But this brings me to the second issue that the government has not put before the people. Fianna Gael promised that the people that they would reduce the number of TDs by 20. And then the government discovered that this can't be done without a constitutional change. This certainly would save money and reduce numbers. This could be put to the people, but instead they propose that the Irish people should just lob off one of the integral arms of governance in the Irish Constitution, with no substantive proposals for increased oversight or scrutiny of the executive or the cabinet. And now, 3 weeks before the referendum, we've been given some proposals for Dáil reform, but they hold little that is new or innovative. And one of the reforms that they tout as being the most innovative of all, that members of the public and civil society groups to come to begin part of the pre-legislative scrutiny. They are regularly already asked to make submissions to Oireachtas committees. This is nothing new. Whereas in a reformed Shannon, concerned citizens and civil society experts could become lawmakers within the Shannon, to be voted for on the basis of their knowledge and expertise in their field, not just those to be consulted with without real power to make laws. But most importantly, none of the proposals put forward in relation to Dáil reform, supposedly to hold the government to account, will be put in the Constitution. So the government can make these changes and then reverse these changes according to their desires. So Dáil reform is not being put to the people either. It's now just being dangled as a carrot, vote to abolish the Shannon, and we will bequeath the people when we feel it's the right time to bring in some of these reforms. Otherwise, the government will beat the people with the stick of no Shannon reform if they vote to retain it. What kind of a free parliament is this? This contrasts sharply with institutions of governance in the Nordic countries that the government uses to boast its weak arguments. We're not comparing like with like, and I think we need to be very clear about this. Both Sweden and Denmark made changes to their constitutions to ensure a scrutiny of government power when they moved to one chamber. For example, the Riksdag Committee in Sweden on the Constitution is constitutionally required to examine ministers' performance and handling of government business. And while ministers sit in the parliament, they don't have a vote. Or in Denmark, their 1953 constitution strengthened checks on executive power when they got rid of their second house. Or in Finland, the 29th article of its constitution says a representative is obliged to follow justice and truth in his or her office. He or she shall abide by the constitution and no other orders are binding on him or her. Translated, they can follow their conscience to check executive power without them being thrown out of their parties or their offices. So, let us contrast the government's proposals for change that will not be constitutionally ratified by the people, nor even be debated by the people, much less the Oireachtas, with the Shannon reform proposals put forward by Senator Fergal Quinn and myself. They are the result of a wide and lengthy consultation with the people over 18 months that we put into this bill of 77 pages that has passed the second stage of debate in the Shannon, accepted by the government parties. All parties accepted it, and it is awaiting debate as well in the Dáil. There is no reason why a modern Ireland can't have two chambers. Modern does not equal one. Modern means that we have institutions of governance that are representative of the best interests of all people, both the majority and the minorities. Modern means that we have parliamentary forms of deliberation whereby it is the lawmakers themselves who bring diverse and minority backgrounds to the tables of lawmaking. Modern means that excluded voices are let in, that we have pluralism and independence at the tables where law is generated, amended, improved, and enhanced. And this, I think, is a prime way of holding an executive to account. Modern, I think, dictates that we have a People's Shannon. This is at the heart of our Shannon Bill 2013 that the government passed in its first hearing. And this is what it would look like. One person, one vote, along with those who've been forced to immigrate and Northern Ireland residents. There would be an equal number of women and men. Candidates for the Seanad would not represent geography as they do in the Dáil, but represent expertise and practical knowledge in farming or education or industry or equality or human rights or labor or literature or culture. Political parties would no longer control nominations and elections, getting rid, therefore, of the elitism, so new voices, independents and minorities could be at the heart of our lawmaking system. We are uniquely placed within Europe to imagine a radical new form of governance that includes a second house rather than excludes it. We have the opportunity to choose a diversity and breadth of voices rather than the imposition of oneness and sameness. This is what freedom means together. And so if we legislate for a people's Seanad, those who would come to our houses of the Oireachtas today could say, as JFK did some 50 years ago, that they are deeply honored to be our guest in the free parliament of a free Ireland.
Let me get the audience's vote there. Your bill, admirable though it is, it strikes me that it did take the creak of the hangman's trapdoor before it was produced. And one of the problems perhaps down the years is that while the senators accepted there was something amiss and dysfunctional, that they couldn't agree on a plan to reform the Seanad. And I think that is part of the reason that we've come to this rather unusual referendum campaign, where if you recall your Roman history, the way Irish were punished was by a process of decimation, whereby they chose which of their colleagues would be stoned to death. It seems to me that the government is proposing to Seanad is something similar, getting rid of 60 other political colleagues. It's also a rather unreal debate, I think, in that obviously this audience here is well acquainted with the Seanad and its workings, but among the electorate, I think the first argument is to tell people that the Seanad exists, and then what to be done with it. A well of indifference, I'm sorry to say, towards this campaign. And then to sum up, DCU political scientist Jane Sousa will give us her assessment of the argument so far.
I'd like to echo Catherine's thing there about what a fantastic event this is and how delighted I am to be here. So thank you, Noel, and all the other organisers. So I think we're told variously, and we've heard it, the Seanad is either a vital bastion of democracy without which an unscrupulous and uncaring executive will trample over all of our rights, or else it's a bloated and wasteful bureaucracy, and if we get rid of it, we'll have hundreds of new special needs teachers. I think this is a pity. I think that the Seanad and the people deserve a lot more than this kind of populist rhetoric. And the whole idea of the reform not being up for consideration. But I also think that there's far more important issues on the political reform agenda than the Seanad's retention or abolition. So I think if you bear with me, I think it's worth just a minute or two of very brief historical detour into the history of parliamentary representation in Ireland, just to see how it is that we got here. And I'm indebted here to Professor John Coakley of UCD. He published a fantastic new book during the week, Reforming Political Institutions, which I think anybody who's serious about this debate should go out and buy. But essentially, the very first parliaments in the 11th and 12th centuries were state-based. So they were a way of bringing together medieval societies. You had the clergy, the nobility, the bourgeois, and a few free peasants, carpenters, and so on. This was the norm until about the 14th century, when the commons, representing the gentry and the bourgeois, began to meet separately from the upper nobility and clergy. And that's really when the Irish Parliament began to take shape in the 14th and 15th century. And in fact, at that point, it was tricameral. So it had the Lords and the Commons, and then also the proctors of the lower clergy, who constituted the third house. They went off in the Reformation. And then following that, it looked much like the Westminster system of the Commons and the Lords until 1800, when essentially the members took, McGrattan's Parliament took a bribe and went off to Westminster to continue to be Lords. And that more or less remained the status quo over the 19th century, until we began to have demands, and these are the kind of demands that we're hearing even now today about this debate about it being equal. So the four tails: direct, equal, universal, and secret voting. And these began to accelerate in the early 20th century, and eventually a state-based representation was eliminated virtually everywhere, except in Westminster, where we had the Lord Spiritual, the Church of England, and Temporal, the other ones chosen by the Queen, but representation until just 1999. But perhaps because of the strength of this Westminster tradition in Ireland, all of our Home Rule legislation involved bicameral arrangements. The final such bill, it was true in all of the Home Rule bills, the Government of Ireland Bill in 1912 allowed for a House of Commons and a House of Lords. Senators then were to be entirely just nominated by the Lord Lieutenant, so there was little democracy there. But as demands for democracy grew, this was amended to allow for direct election by PRS-TV. So this is the first time that this came in and the electoral system that we have now. So the first Senate of Southern Ireland required members to be resident here, and there were to be three members, Lord Mayors and the Lord Chancellor, 17 members nominated, so we see that that's still through in our kind of nomination process. And they had to represent bankers, labour and the scientific and learned professions, Catholic bishops, Church of Ireland bishops, and so on. And then there was just going to be 14 county or borough councils. But when Sinn Féin took 124 out of 128 of the seats in the House of Commons and refused to work with the institutions of Southern Ireland, that one disappeared. But nonetheless, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 retained the notion of a second chamber. And it's interesting what the reason for that was given. It was seen as a guarantee against too much democracy, on the one hand, and too much nationalism on the other. So the Senate of the new Irish Free State was directly elected for 12 years. Candidates were nominated by the Dáil on the basis that they'd done honour to the nation, so they weren't party political. So the first election had the whole territory of the Free State as one single constituency. So there was no geographic representation there, and they were elected by PRS-TV. There were 76 candidates on that, and it took 67 counts to complete it. So it took 3 weeks to complete that count for the first Senate election. So I think this must have been too much democracy for the other house. So by the next election in 1928, the general electorate was abolished, and what we had was replaced just by Dáil deputies and existing senators. So that's where the will of the people came, and we just had it very party political. So this was inherently party political and lacking in democratic accountability because the vote had been taken away from the people. But the first one, the one that was democratically elected, had left a really credible record. Its amendments affected 37% of bills. 8 bills were rejected. 2 of them were subsequently dropped by the government. Nonetheless, by 1936, the Seanad was actually abolished altogether, and we had a brief period of unicameralism, of just having the one chamber. This, of course, changed in 1937 with our constitution, and the new Senate was reformed with 11 nominated members, 49 vocational ones, and 6 of the vocational ones were to be elected by graduates. Otherwise, it was actually left open, the system of nomination to some extent. And that's essentially the system that we still have today. And the intention here was to represent vocational interests. So I kind of wonder about this from Catherine's bill as well. So this idea of representing vocational interests, it comes from Catholic social teaching, also some ideas of Italian fascism, and even the socialist ideas of the Fabians at the time. It was actually the closest you could get to the old estates-based idea of representation from the old medieval era. And it was mainly popular in Catholic countries in the interwar years. So Portugal, Austria, and Italy all had it there. In the early 21st century, the only countries which still have at least nominally a states-based representation are Ireland and Slovenia. So even though we have this as states-based, so it's meant to be we have the different panels, as I'm sure most of the people, there's a few county councillors in here, so they know exactly what it is. So you could have the IFA nominating its own leader into the agricultural policy panel or whatever, but because it's so highly party political, this doesn't happen, and so it's been very politicised, and it also has much less power, as we know, much less ability to delay legislation and so on. So as a result, its legislative record is really weak. Only 2 bills have been voted down since 1937. There was a constitutional amendment bill in '59, and then the one that Pearse referred to that was a mistake, which was actually a pawnbroker's bill in 1963. It's only amended 13% of bills between 1970 and 1994. Compare that to the 37% of bills that the first Seanad, which have been directly elected by the people, have done. So since 1922, it's only processed 72 private bills, and since 1980, only 5. And it's never referred a bill to the President. The calls for its abolition are almost as old as the institution. My stepdad was actually going through one of his uncle's papers recently, and I found a 1957 editorial. He was a Fianna Fáil senator, actually. And he found an Irish Independent editorial which called the Seanad a pension house for politicians, and called for a reformed Seanad or no Seanad, and railed against an institution where it noted the public has no say in the election of members. Does that sound familiar? So the problem with second chambers was summed up by Abbey Sears in the early years of the French Revolution. And the idea is, if a second chamber dissents from the first, it's mischievous. If it agrees with it, it's superfluous. But of course there are reform options, and these should be on the table for discussion, but of course they're not. So thus, instead of having a reasoned debate on abolition or reform, we have the currently heavily researched focus group dominated campaign. You can hear the focus group phrases coming out in the campaigns of both sides. A lot of populist messaging. Fewer politicians. Who's going to argue with that? A power grab by an out-of-touch elite. Ditto. I think future researchers, and maybe even SIPA, if it ever were to be strengthened, will be very interested to find out how much has actually been spent by focus groups in advance of and during this campaign. The Seanad then is in reality a relatively innocuous institution in its current format. It's in need of reform, but it will probably not undermine our democracy significantly if the people decide either to abolish it or disable it. Yet surely it deserved more sustained and balanced consideration before being consigned to history. I think despite the hubris, the bluff and the bluster, the Seanad abolition referendum is really a sideshow when it comes to political reform in Ireland. Pinning the mainstay of political reform in this type of populist messaging is a real wasted opportunity to undertake real and meaningful political reform in Ireland. We should be focusing on what really matters, which, as almost every speaker here has told you in some way, is Dáil reform, in order to counter what's our greatest problem, which is executive dominance. And it's surely no accident that the 2 weakest parliaments in Europe are the Dáil and the Greek Thule. Look back where that got both of our countries. Until earlier this week, there was little evidence of anything that could reasonably be called Dáil reform. This week, however, a reform proposal was published, and you heard the Minister giving you a few details. These reforms are welcome. There will be earlier scrutiny, if you heard, input to legislation from TDs, and even citizens might have the opportunity to make an impact. But in reality, the package as a whole just tinkers around with the detail of when and where TDs will work. Working extra days or longer hours achieves nothing if the relationship between the Dáil and the government is not addressed. Unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, hardly a single measure in the proposal incentivises the Dáil to be more aggressive in its scrutiny of the government. First of all, look at the guillotine, which the government uses to ram through legislation. This was supposed to decrease, but I think 67% of bills have been put through in this kind of rush manner, where essentially there can be no debate. The property tax one had to come back with over 20 amendments because such a mess was made of it because of this lack of scrutiny. So I don't think anybody can reasonably argue that the use of guillotines to limit debate on legislation is and has been excessive in Ireland. In most of the European countries, guillotines are limited to emergencies. Of course, there's times when they're necessary, but the government's target, and I don't think it even made it into the final package, was a 20% reduction in the use of guillotine. But even with that, it's still almost half of all bills can be rammed through in this way. The government is also stressing, as we heard, that committee chairs will be elected under the D'Hondt system, so that all parties can have a chairmanship. That's fine. But in reality, the committee chairs are in the gift of the party leaders. And so the party leaders and the parties can control the TDs through the allocation of posts. So the party leaders will still be allocating the posts. And even more importantly, they'll have the ability just to take away the posts should the chairman happen to vote against them or do something else that displeases them or the party. So far better to elect the chairs by secret ballot. TDs know who is good in that role, and it will incentivise them to work for the Dáil, to work for the Parliament, rather than for the executive and for the government. Committees also need better research support. They can take all the evidence they like, but a comma might be changed by a minister. Even the recent LIFE legislation, we saw there were few changes. But if committees actually had proper research support and they could have input into the actual drafting, then they could have a real impact. But even if we do take the reforms that we've been offered at face value, I think it's simply bizarre that the government says that some of these changes can only be enacted if the Seanad is abolished. Even though senators are on committees, so it's a little bit more complicated if it's not abolished, it's simply not beyond the wit of man to devise a system where they can implement the changes should the people decide to retain the second chamber. And of course, I think it's really important to remember that what the Seanad does provide for is the possibility, however remote, that the Taoiseach could appoint a non-TD as a minister. We all know that Gary Fitzgerald last did that with Jim Doogue. Abolishing the Seanad without making provision for non-TDs in Cabinet is essentially anti-reform and takes us even further away from Western European norms, where many countries do not allow their representatives to double job as local TDs and as ministers at the same time. I think this is the minimum reform we should demand if the Seanad is to be abolished. Give the Dáil seriously more powers and perhaps even end the dual mandate of ministers and TDs. But I think back in the real world, the bottom line is the debate is whether we should vote to retain the Seanad or abolish it. There is no reform option. So really, it depends on whether you believe a no will force the government to put greater reform on the table, or if the best thing to do is to take the bird in hand. The choice should not have been made in this way, but the choice is now yours.
So the Seanad referendum wasted opportunity and something that is effectively anti-reform. We can just ask our panelists to pick up their microphones there. We have time for a discussion and some questions. I suppose, Richard Bruton, since your government is proposing this, that is the issue really, isn't it? That you're not actually offering the people a genuine choice. You're saying, do away with this dysfunctional institution as you see it, or retain it, whereas there is a middle ground that you could have opted for, which is a package of reforms.
Well, I think what we sought and campaigned in the last general election for was a set of political reforms which included the abolition of the Senate as part of those proposals. And they were based on the fact that the Senate, as we've heard here, is ineffective. It hasn't been a check on legislation. It has a mandate that's based on patronage and so on. And we decided that what we need is a reformed Dáil, not to scratch around looking to see could we find some purpose for a redundant institution that was so deeply flawed. And we looked to other countries and saw that small countries of our size have gone the very same route. Now we can all criticise the extent of Dáil reform and put forward proposals for more Dáil reform, and that will continually be the case. But as a TD who, as someone said, is 30 years in politics, you know, the idea that legislation could now be framed from the very start by the Dáil is radically different. And I heard someone say these changes would make no difference. I was spokesman when the flawed central bank bill came into the House some years ago, which many blame for our regulatory collapse. And I thought at that stage that it should not go ahead until we had proper scrutiny of whether our system was fit for practice. And that was denied. That would not be denied under the new system. We would now have hearings where the TDs would bring in
expertise, whether they be bankering expertise, regulatory expertise, and it would be different. So this is a fundamental change. And the reason we're not putting forward alternatives is we do not believe that a redundant institution that's ineffective and wrongly based we shouldn't seek to breathe life back into it. And indeed, when you look at those who advocate retention, they don't agree. What reform do they talk about? Is it the Catherine Zappone's reform? Is it John Crown's reform? Is it the new reform that Fianna Fáil have produced? Is it the Aidan Ryan reform? There are umpteen people who want to hang on to an institution that we believe is redundant, who are now clinging to reform as the excuse for retaining an institution that I think has no proper foundation.
Just to bring Micheál Martin in there, if you will, Minister, you probably want to respond to fairly trenchant criticism from Pierce Doherty that your party in power did absolutely nothing to reform the Seanad and in fact connived at putting people, appointing cronies and so on. But another question you might answer, Micheál, is that what is your party's verdict on the government's package this week? Because you haven't said very much about it, bar saying that you weren't consulted.
What we have, I think it's tinkering with the system. It's not fundamental reform in any shape or form, and as I said earlier, it doesn't in any way change any aspect of government power or autonomy. In other words, it doesn't concede or give any power that government currently has back to Parliament. I think I would argue that we do need a fundamental separation between the executive and the Parliament. We need a parliamentary system that is independent of government. All political parties said before the election they would do that, learning lessons from the economic crisis. That's the central point I would make. In our view, and we looked at this over the last 2.5 years, and having experienced the government's behaviour over the last 2.5 years in terms of its absolute dominance of the Dáil and refusal to consult with anybody about anything really, we're left in no doubt that a reformed and new Seanad is a vital part of the architecture that would help to develop a corporate sort of personal identity that Parliament urgently needs in this country. It is completely, the government dictates, for example, when the Dáil meets, the length of time the Dáil meets, what the Dáil discusses, how long it can discuss a bill, what amendments can be tabled. Even opposition private members' bills have to have a government vote first on its proposals, vis-à-vis that private members' bill, before we can even discuss or before we can even vote on the government bill. The key point is, I think it's quite insulting. The Taoiseach said, rather, 2 months ago, he said to me, I will consult with you, I'm going to bring forward some proposals, and I will talk to you and to Deputy Adams before I make him a fait accompli. He actually said that, that's on the record of the House. Now what he has actually done, he made him a fait accompli before he even talked to us. And so how can we take government in trust if they don't even consult on reforming the Dáil, reform measures, minor and all as they are, with people in the House before announcing them and using them as an attempt to deflect criticism about their lack of reform proposals in the context of the Seanad debate.
Catherine Zappone, you're a non-party senator. What has the experience been like for you? I know you've been very active in the House, but have you found it frustrating as the dead hand of the party system impeded you?
I have had, sorry, is that on? Yes, okay, thanks, David. Yes, I think I have had experiences of frustration, as any senator or TD has in the context of an overall parliament where we do have both a very active guillotining and also a whipping. But one of the things I'd like to say too, though, as a senator in the last couple of years, I certainly feel as if there has been a number of ways in which, and demonstrable ways in which the Senate has been effective. And certainly in terms of my own experience, for example, as a senator, through my exchanges with the government, the Minister for Finance, I have had and enabled changes in 3 finance bills in relation to ensuring an equivalence of treatment between same-sex partners and civil partnership and married spouses. Do those amendments register as my amendments, or do they register as government amendments? They register as government amendments. But the minister said to me, he wanted to listen to me, he wanted to ensure that equivocation, and I've had piles of letters between my office, his office, the Revenue Commissioner, working together in order to ensure that government can bring forward amendments in order for that to happen. That's just one example. And as well, in my experience in the last couple of years, Fergal Quinn's construction contract bill passed Seanad as well as Dáil. It's become a new law. Senator Ivana Bacik's bill on civil registration amendment bill became an act. So humanists are now to allow to officiate marriage. So the way in which the Shannon holds government to account is not just on how many bills it blocks or sends back to the Dáil. It's on all the ways in which we amend and improve and generate new legislation. Sometimes not recorded in the way I think maybe sociologists have recorded in the past. There hasn't been a huge amount of research in relation to effectiveness in a qualitative way, as I'm describing, as well as a quantitative way in relation to the Shannon.
That view endorsed, I think, by a contributor to our microblog there, says the Shannons made 259 amendments to legislation in this term alone. Pierce Doherty is an effective invigilator, even if it doesn't bark very often.
It's quite interesting, you know, those figures, because we can talk about figures and we can use figures to suit our own agenda, but, you know, in terms of the 259 amendments, what happens in a lot of legislation, and I think the Senate, the credit union bill would be a good example, is we deal with it in Finance Committee, the senators are there contributing as well, the minister has to say, he goes, I'm going to make these changes, I've listened to you, but I have to go to Cabinet next week, so therefore I can't bring it in, change it in the Dáil, I'll bring it in the Shannon. So if the Shannon didn't exist, the amendments would still happen, but it would happen at a later stage that has been proposed, the fifth stage, a new fifth stage. So it's not as if that it's the 60 senators that are making all of these 259 amendments. It's the fact that you have a government that hasn't got its act together early enough to bring the amendments forward, and that's not diminishing the role that has been played, particularly by Catherine in the previous finance bill.
So that's an element of the government's reform package that you would welcome then, this extended legislative process.
I think the government's reform package is progress, but you know it's not the type of radical reform that we would like to see. But I think that the extra stage is to be welcome. I think you know the government have announced parliamentary questions, for example, to be submitted before during the summer recess. We're still not allowed to do that. There's other measures that need to be addressed. But the problem again in terms of political reform is everybody has a different view of political reform. Like this debate that's happening here about Shannon reform, you know, it may be the first time it's happened openly, publicly, but the first item of a new Shannon, every single term, is Shannon reform. I was part and parcel of the Shannon I was involved in. Before that, all the parties agreed on Shannon reform. Before that, all the parties agreed on Shannon reform. There's been 12 reports. The problem, the fundamental question is here, do you trust the political system to reform an institution that goes beyond protecting their own? And we can see from Micheál Martin's comments in relation to Fine Gael, he doesn't trust Fine Gael to reform the Dáil, but yet we're somehow going to believe that they're going to reform the Shannon. Which doesn't add up.
I mean, David, I think there's a wider dimension to all of this. I mean, it took Sinn Féin, by the way, 64 years to recognise the Dáil. There's a wider dimension to passing amendments and passing legislation that Parliament engage in. Never understate the importance of public debate in democracy and opening up the opportunities and the platforms for people who may not make it through the Dáil election, who may not be involved in political parties, to make a telling contribution. No, like Gordon Wilson, okay, whose daughter was brutally murdered in Skilling. And I can tell you the impact he had in Leinster House and the Irish people by the generosity of spirit he showed, the forgiveness he showed. He changed our attitudes to Northern Ireland by being a member of Shannon. Who would have lambasted my party time and time again for our perspective, or his sense of our perspective of nationalism and republicanism. But it was a defining voice nonetheless in Shannon. Mary Robinson, former president. You know, Seamus Mallon. And
Mary Robinson has made comments publicly about the institution itself.
But I accept that there's deficiencies in Shannon. I'm not advocating the retention of the Shannon as is, but I'm just making the point that in democracy, it's not all about the technical amendments of bills, and that's important. I think crucially in a democracy, we should cherish the whole concept of public discourse, the formation and articulation of opinion, and I regret the taking away, the suggestion that we should take away a platform, which I think in respect of many personalities, has had a decided influence and impact on public debate and progression in Ireland.
I think the issue is who ultimately decides on legislation. The people who are elected by every citizen, Dáil deputies, they are the people who must make decisions in the interest of citizens. Yes, we can have contributors, and that's the whole point of the hearing. You can bring in expertise, legal opinion, or you can bring in civic groups, But it's finally, at the end of the day, it's one person, one vote. You elect a person. There's no reason why there should be some premium votes for the Taoiseach or for other people to pack a house. You should have your deputy that you pick at the heart of the legislative process.
But you could
And
change
of course,
that by
no one
legislation,
denies
Mr.
that.
Bruton. You could change that by legislation. The method of election to Shannon is not in the Constitution. You could make it one man, one vote, one person, one vote.
So then you'd have two parliaments elected in the same way. That would make no sense. I mean, what we need, and you look across all countries of our size, they have one parliament that's effective. Now we've introduced a set of reforms. They can be continued to be reformed. They are like look at what Micheál Martin's government introduced. You didn't bring in any of these changes. You didn't end corporate donations. You didn't bring in an independent fiscal council. You actually diluted the Freedom of Information Act. So we are bringing in reform. By all means, if you have more reforms in the law, let's talk about further reforms. And that is always the opportunity. But the idea that some house that's elected by 1% of the people should in some way have a role to give privilege to some groups who have voted in that house, that I think is anathema to democratic principles, in my view.
But just before we go to the audience, Richard Bruton, politics is about choices. The government has chosen this issue of Shannon abolition, and many would think it's not particularly politically central or pressing. Somebody again on the microblog is saying, why aren't we having a referendum on upward-only rent reviews? You're the jobs for this. There are many jobs have been lost because of the government's inability, they say, to act on this issue. Why not have a referendum on that?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that the problem with upward-only rent is really what we're debating here. The problem with upward-only rent review is that the government, if you're to expropriate something from anyone,
But we were told it was a constitutional problem.
yeah, the issue is you have to compensate. Our constitution protects property. So if you try to take property off someone and say that you're going to fix their rent below market rent, you are taking something off people, and our constitution doesn't allow that. Now you have to decide, are you going to change that principle? So there is the state going to arbitrarily pick one or two or three or other people and say, your property is going to be downvalued or whatever. That is the difficulty that I think you find, and it is, that constitutional change I think would be pretty fundamental. The person who owns that property, the person that owns that property, no, we sought to do it within the constitution, and we introduced changes under NAMA. But we introduced changes in NAMA where someone in real difficulty could go. But the problem with upward-only rent is that the person who will be renting it may be exposed to their bank, may have borrowed in their banks, may have exposed. So the state, for the state to implement such a change, we would have to be getting into the compensation business, and the taxpayer has had to pay out heaps of money in protecting the banks. It would be another source of paying out, and that wasn't possible.
I see a number of people from the audience want to contribute. The gentleman closest to me here, so we have a microphone to him in the front row on the left. No. Oh, this man has a microphone first. We'll come to you later, sir.
My name is Billy Maroney from Ross, and I was attached to a political party many years ago, but I'm not attached to any political party now. I was a candidate on a number of occasions for Shannon, and would certainly have a great interest in the Shannon and in our democratic system. Interestingly enough, when I was a candidate for the Shannon on the first occasion, one of my fellow candidates was Richard Bruton. He was elected to the Shannon in 1981, if I recollect properly. I have a very nice letter from him actually in my file somewhere, where he thanks me for an unexpected but vital transfer that he received from me that secured his election when I was eliminated. But he got that through his own activities, and no credit is due to me. Times of recession and times of depression, history has taught us are very dangerous times for democracy. We're in that situation now. And I see posters up around the town, gone up around here in the last few days. Abolish the Shannon and save 20 million. How low can you go? Is that the price that they have put on our democratic institutions? That's the price they have. What is the value of it? what role, if the Shannon was allowed to play a proper role as it should be in our democratic system, what price would you put on the role that it could play in unifying our island? I, like many others in this country, yearn for unity. We will not achieve unity by bombs or bullets. We will achieve unity by unifying the hearts and minds of the people. And what better way could we go about this than to give the people of Northern Ireland proper representation in the Shannon,
Very good, very good.
and that they could come to an understanding amongst us, that we could come to an understanding amongst us and a trust that doesn't exist at the moment.
Thanks, Billy. I think we put that to our panel here. Pierce,
I have more points to make. If,
Okay,
please.
very briefly, with these men people.
I have here before me, and I'm skipping over much, there's a lot of people. I have here before me a definition of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is demanding a total submission of the individual to the requirements of the state. I'll change 2 words on that, and we'll see where reform is required. Demanding the total submission of TDs to the requirements of their party. We have totalitarianism at the very centre of our legislature, where our TDs, our backbench TDs, are reduced to pressing buttons, and they're told which way they can vote, and if they don't do that, they're subject to sanction, as we have seen in recent times.
Right, Billy, I think that is a fundamental point, and I'll cut you off there if I may, because I would like to put that to our panel. And first, Pierce Darby. So there's just the only really fundamental reform, as Billy was suggesting there, is the abolition of the crib system, not the Shannon.
Yeah, well, let me do just, I think you've got 3 points. First of all, in relation to the point about what's the cost of democracy, I think you can't put a cost on democracy. And if the Shannon was actually to cost the state money in its abolition, I would still be advocating for the abolition of the Shannon, because the second part of your question is about democracy. I have 5 votes in the next Shannon election if there are one. Some of my colleagues have 6 votes. Others, because they went to 2 universities, have 7 votes. My sister has 1 vote. Most people that I represent in Donegal have no vote. That is not democracy. So we're not protecting democracy, we're protecting a flawed system. Now, we may be talking about some concept in the future, and that goes back to what I'm talking about, your vision of what it could be. We voted against the government's legislation for the referendum because we believe this matter should be left with the constitutional referendum. Let the people, because politicians for 12 reports, a constitutional referendum have shown that they're incapable of reforming the system. So let the Constitutional Convention decide whether 1 or 2 chambers were necessary and what type of view that chamber would happen. In relation to the whip system, I think it's an issue that's been hugely in the media, particularly because of expulsions. The concern I would have is this. We have a government at this point in time which has reneged and reversed on many commitments that have been introduced. We have the Labour Party talking about, child benefit. We have Richard Bryn, we mentioned earlier on, upward-only rent reviews. We can remember the banners in Grafton Street and whatnot. And they reneged on it. If you go to the electorate as a party and stand for a set of principles and ideas and then allow every member in your party to vote against that, basically hoodwinking the electorate into believing that they were voting for something that they weren't, then there's a serious problem as well. And that's where I have concerns. So we need to find a balance in relation to the whip system, but also in ensuring that the vision that a political party stands can actually be implemented if the public give them their trust and endorsement.
Just very briefly, Leo.
Just on that point, the difference though is that the whip system is a party issue. Point taken. And there's a balance to be struck between effective delivery of government and policies and having some clear critical mass in the parliament to get decisions through. However, the application of it in recent times is saying that the party owns the parliament. So, for example, Peter Matthews, who's quite a good person on finance and banking, is just taken off the finance committee. In this sense that the party owns the parliament. Okay, expel the person from the parliament, suspend the person from the party. But if we're to change radically our system, we're all saying we want to change it. But I think the first step would be, we don't own the parliament. And if someone at the beginning of the parliament is nominated to a parliamentary committee because either they have an interest in that particular part of work or have an expertise in that part of work, they shouldn't be unilaterally or arbitrarily or just in
as a kind of fit of anger, be removed from that committee. Talking to Senator Crichton in the European Affairs Committee, talking to Peter Matthews, Dennis Naughton on health, who's been there for the last 2 years because he voted against the governor's comment. He's thrown off the health committee. And I think we have to, all of us that put in the party, say we don't own the parliament. And that's a big mindset change for us to make, but we need to make it.
Discipline to work, it has to hurt a bit. Perhaps that's the reason the parties use the written dialogue. Gentlemen in the audience that have the microphone.
Malcolm Byrne, as a declared interest, I'm a Fianna Fáil member of Wexford County Council. And my question is, it follows on from Richard Bruton's point about international best practice, and he cites a number of European countries, Denmark and Sweden, and he also mentions New Zealand, which have unicameral chambers. Syria, Somalia and Chad also have unicameral chambers, but they're not mentioned. But my point about somewhere like Denmark was, when Denmark moved towards a unicameral system, what it did was it actually enormously strengthened local government. And the difficulty that we have here is local government in Ireland, what we actually have is local administration. We're now seeing town councils being abolished, control over water services is now being centralised. So more power is actually being taken away from local government. In fact, in Denmark, what they did when they moved to a unicameral system was not towards fewer politicians, but actually towards more politicians at a local level with real power. And my contention would be that you can't make it a comparison with best international practice, because best international practice in democratic unicameral countries are those that have strong and accountable systems of local government. I think what the people want is not actually fewer politicians, what they want is better politicians.
You haven't had a great deal of time. Political subsidiarity is effectively what's needed. We need to have power moved down the food chain, not concentrated in this with us.
Yes, I mean, I would be absolutely in agreement with that, and also in agreement with what the speaker said, is that that the government isn't comparing like with like when it's putting forward the proposal to abolish. So I absolutely agree with that, but I think what's very uniquely distinctive about the reform, not just proposals, but the reform bill that Senator Quinn and I have going through the Houses of the Oireachtas right now, is that we have put together the proposals whereby Shannon can be radically reformed through legislation. It can be radically reformed through legislation. How would that be? By how people are nominated, by how they are elected, and also what the Shannon does. And if you change that, then you will get different people into lawmaking, and you will increase minority voices, you will increase a diversity and a sense of independent voices in the Shannon. So it's not just a question of the way in which the process of scrutiny of law, but it's actually who is doing the scrutiny. And our proposals provide an opportunity to open up in a way that isn't possible in the Dáil at present, and particularly, as we all know, with TDs, with that dual kind of focus of what's going on within national policy and also what's going on within local constituencies. But a reformed Shannon wouldn't have to be focused on that local, that what's coming from a local perspective, that they are in fact coming from that expertise and practical experience and knowledge. And so it's who is doing the scrutiny. And furthermore, included in our proposals is a reduction of the costs of the Shannon too. So it's not that we're not attentive to the issue of money, but what we want is better scrutiny by a diversity of voices doing that.
Richard Bruton, I think it's not points I think were directed largely at the government's handling of the issue. What's your response?
Well, I don't think the public want more politicians. I don't
Not
think
even
that's
at a local level.
No, I don't think so. I think what we're proposing is to reduce the number of councillors from 1,600 to 950, and that is something we're implementing, but we're keen to devolve more power. And I think we do need a more effective local democracy. And in my own department, one of the things we're doing is devolving first-stop shop support for enterprise down to now push it into local authorities. And I think that's, empowerment of local authorities is right. But best practice in managing national parliaments is certainly one parliament system. And every party in the last general election said they would abolish the Senate. Not just Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, Labour, but Fianna Fáil as well. So all parties, including your own, said that this was a proposal that should be put forward and should be considered by the public. And we are doing that. And I firmly believe that, we should not be seeking to breathe life into a redundant, undemocratic, ineffective institution. And yes, we can bring diverse voices, but you bring those with the person that's elected by every citizen at the heart of hearing those voices, diverse and all, and then making decisions best move forward. I think that's the way a proper democracy should work. And that's what I think.
The higher citizens say that you're reducing the management.
Number of councillors. And it's all about numbers and sort of setting a slogan or a song like we're dramatically reducing the number of councillors. What you've done is you're going to abolish urban councils. We're at the lowest tier of political participation in the country, who don't cost a whole lot, and who, from what I can see, haven't done anything too wrong. You look at Westport, you look at Gorey, you look at Kinsale, Clonakilty, towns where they had town councils, which basically represent a group of people being elected to help advance their local community and their local town. For the life of me, I think it's very
Not in Dublin.
I do not understand.
But you go
I
round
don't
and-
understand why
you
they
go
should
round
be.
and look at what has
But I think
happened in
nobody-
other institutions of the state.
But Richard, they don't-
We've had to reduce
That's not
numbers
reform,
in
Richard.
all-
But it's not reform.
This is
This is
reform.
not a technocratic
This
thing
is
about
reform.
reducing numbers here and
This
there.
is reform.
The Republican state means people
rationalise,
should be
for
allowed to
example-
participate in democracy.
For
They
example,
should be allowed to
like-
participate.
For example, just give you an
You're
example.
taking away that
My own
opportunity.
department,
They're open
we have 5 institutions dealing with employment rights. We are rationalising those down to 2 institutions, one of first instance and one of appeal. That will require fewer people working in those areas. So we are reducing the size of the number of people in this institution in the context of a reform package that will give better workers' rights, more prompt access to justice. That's reform, and the same way we need to do that in
The
politics.
difference
And
there is
generally,
between amalgamation and abolition. I'd like to go to the audience again. I don't know if we got a microphone to that man in the...
Yeah, Chairman, my name is Declan McPartlin. I'm an independent member of Wexford County Council. I'm a bit prejudiced because my grandfather represented the Labour interest in the first Senate. But I was amazed at the proponents here, firstly talking about the watchdog of the Senate not parking over months and years. But bearing in mind that the political parties put poodles into the Senate with the strict mandate not to bark, that's surprising. In regard to Pierce Doherty's curious connection between local authorities and the European Union. Now, I know you're Eurosceptic, but for the life of me, I cannot understand what you're getting at, suggesting that empowering local authorities, which is not going to happen, it doesn't matter what way they cloak it, there is not going to be empowerment of local authorities, unlike in other unicameral systems where local government places power involved. So I'd like to, is it that you fear in Sinn Féin the people, and the people having a say in who shall go into the Senate? Bearing in mind that you did the unholy alliance with Labour in order to get your first seats in the Senate and to maintain that little connection. I mean, as an ordinary citizen and as an independent thinker in these matters, and as a person who served in the government in the early 80s and realised how dysfunctional the oil was, and indeed the Senate at the time, what have you to fear about a reformed Senate? Is it that the people will put in people who are not Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour and Sinn Féin?
It's very interesting question, I think. First of all, my connection to the theme of this event that we're about to do was about political reform, local government, and Dáil and Shannon reform. Obviously, because of the election, it's focused on Shannon. And that's what my contribution was, that we need to empower local democracy. And I agree with the previous speaker that local democracy hasn't been empowered. Indeed, in previous years, we've seen a disempowerment of local democracy. So we do need empowerment, but we also need the Dáil in the future not to be just a rubber stamp from legislation in terms of Europe. You see in the Irish Times today about how the government will submit their budget in the middle of October, and the European Union will decide whether they're going to pass it or not. So it's about seeking up sovereignty, and we just need to be mindful of that in the political reform context. In relation to what do we fear about democracy in Sinn Féin, nothing. That is why we are arguing that one person, that we shouldn't have a system, and we shouldn't continue with a system that would allow people like me to have 5 votes in the Shannon. Yet my son or daughter in the future won't have any votes. And that's why we have no problem with going to the electorate and asking the people to take power on this issue.
You're afraid of reform.
No, we're not afraid of reform. Can I just answer this? We have contributed in every single debate on Shannon reform. Every single time there's a new Shannon, there's a Shannon reform discussion. There is usually a paper that is agreed between the political parties, but nothing actually happens. We've contributed to that. We've asked for Shannon reform, but we have come to the conclusion that it is not going to happen. How did we come to that conclusion? We've come to the conclusion over 14 years of the last government refused to implement any one of the recommendations that they signed up to. We've come to that conclusion because Fine Gael does not want Shannon reform. We believe it is not going to happen. We believe it is a trick. It is like the FBI sitting down today and discussing who's going to win the All-Ireland final on Sunday next, when they should be talking about who's going to replace Trapattoni. The question before us is, are we going to continue with an institution that is undemocratic or elitist and continue with that into the future, or do we abolish it? And it doesn't prevent any government in the future from bringing forward a constitutional referendum to establish a second House of Parliament. But the difference is that when they decide to do that, it will be the people that they will have to refer to, and not the political parties or the leaders of the political parties who will carve that out for themselves.
I expect there will be many long years before any government introduces a second chamber. They get over the hurdle of abolishing this one.
Yeah, that seems to suggest that. I mean, Lou MacDonald suggested this last week that they're not opposing the second chamber in the future. So the point then is, why get rid of this chamber when there's an opportunity for reform and a genuine option of reform being put to the people?
Which option? Your option, Catherine Bowen's option, our option.
But that option hasn't been put. No option has been put to the people. It's simply abolish it or retain it. No, there was an opportunity. It was called the Constitution. It was called the Constitutional Convention. And the Constitutional Convention would have been a very good.
And came to the conclusion that the best reform
And I deal with that point.
abolition of the Senate.
Yeah, I deal with that. The Constitutional Convention was there as a vehicle, a forum, through which people could have had a very calm, cool discussion about the entire political system, including the Shannon and a second chamber. And what we said, Richard, in the general election, be very clear, we wanted fundamental reforms to the law and the government, that didn't happen.
Parties sought a mandate to reform the law, to do the sort of things we've done, like ending corporate relations, independent fiscal council, quota for women votes, which we've implemented. But part of that mandate for reform was to put to the people the abolition of the Senate. And my party stood for that, Labour Party stood for that, indeed your party stood for that.
We didn't stand for what you're proposing. We did not. Don't misrepresent what we said.
And you're saying you want a multi-choice option. We are putting a very clear program of reform, and it is clear for people, a redundant institution, an institution that I haven't heard a single person say is functioning as it is ought in a democracy. Get rid of that and make our law
Okay,
effective.
Mr. President, we don't want to go to the audience. This gentleman here, I don't think we have a microphone, but I'm sure you can make yourself heard, Brother.
Yeah, my name is Rosa. Yes, I'm a free phone.
Is there anybody here who's a councillor or a member?
Can I ask you a question about Trump? You see, all talk about Trump here, well, 2 minutes ago, me, Hall, and Richard have been in politics today, me, Hall, and Steve Dunn. And you talk about reform. My question is, how can people of the country trust any politician at home?
Here.
I'll talk to you, man. I'll give you two examples. One for you. When you were in party, Martin Cullen pushed down 55 million down the college. And what was the consequence? What happened? No, what was the consequence of that? No, what was the consequence? The consequence was a villa in America somewhere, a big pension, and £100,000 pension. And Richard, when he came into law, the Taoiseach and Kennedy put cap on all of it. And what did he do? He got his money in and gave an extra 23 or 27,000. How can we trust the politicians in the country?
That's the background.
And what's the consequence? As an independent after paying it, what was his consequence? Absolutely not. What should have happened was we should have gotten the body and converted him, dressed in black leathers and put him across the floor.
I think think, Noel, I think you've kind of illustrated the background against which this referendum is taking place. There's kind of a very strong anti-political undercurrent in the country. Richard?
I think obviously people, they have to look at the performance of the government. In the political context, we have ended corporate donations. We have established an independent fiscal council. So in other words, look at our record in political reform. We have restored the Freedom of Information Act. We are introducing whistleblowers legislation. We are going to regulate lobbyists. So we're going to change the sort of way in which politics was done. We are now going and we're introducing a new way in which legislation will be considered, where the Dáil will shape it from its very inception. We're introducing a new form of budget scrutiny, where TDs will examine money before it's spent, and there will be debate on the budget options right through the year, right down to that level of detail. I've been 30 years a deputy, many of those years spent as a finance spokesman, and we were entirely in the dark as to what options were. It was only in June that you started to see what was already committed to. So we are opening up and sharing power with deputies. I'm not saying that our reform agenda is the last word, but I'm very clear that we set out that we needed to deal with politics. The Senate is not an effective institution. It has never been effective. Its base is based on patronage and privilege, which is an unsound base for anything. We need watchdogs on government, but we can provide those watchdogs by strengthening the ombudsman, strengthening the standards in public office, which oversees us, strengthening regulators. None of those were there in 1937 when people talked about consent. But we are providing citizen protections and we're strengthening those. And that's the lesson of the crisis. We strengthen those
Yeah, the first question is, the first point I would make is that you are correct. The big issue for politicians is trust and regaining trust, because we've lost trust. I acknowledge that in my party, leading my party, our biggest mission is to regain trust. And it's going to be a long journey. I'm under no illusions about that. I'm knocking on doors 3 days a week now in different parts of the country, listening to people and hearing what they have to say. What's clear to me is, by the way, they don't want more concentration for ministers. They don't want less oversight, they want more oversight. But I would make the point that, yeah, pensions were excessive, and they were wrong. Right? And we put forward proposals that the taxation system should be used to cut back and reduce significantly earnings through those pensions. I decided not to take those pensions, and I decided not to take the severance payments, and I carried on in politics. Okay, because I have a commitment to politics. But I'm not so sure everything is changing, or there's been dramatic change since the election. I mean, Richard talks about lobbyists, yet for the first time in an unprecedented situation, we see where the tobacco companies get to lead the Taoiseach, which I don't think has ever happened. And I think it's, in terms of public health, in terms of the agenda of the tobacco industry, was a wrong decision by the Taoiseach to do. And it's wrong. Bill Herlihy, who's a strong lobbyist, says that Jimmy Dean was fantastic in organising that access.
I wanted to bring this lady who's been waiting patiently right in the middle of the front row there.
I just like to hold here. I just like to ask a question down the back.
Let this lady, could you come down to the front and give this lady your mic? Because she's in front, and then we can leave it at that. Thank you. We'll come back to you then.
Thanks very much. We are a great little country if we were properly managed and run. Now, we're in a crisis. And I'm saying to you, everyone on this panel, you can all take a lot less in your salaries. 30,000 is more than enough for you. Now, I have worked in local authorities and they're the most corrupt and crooked places to work in. Managers are related to Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour. And I was told, when you're in here, you play the game. And politics is another dirty game. Now, there has to be honesty. We all are going to meet the man above or below. Now, there's not enough honesty in people. And I am not a member of any party because none of you would honour my vote. I'm disgusted with what's going on in this country. It's a disgrace. And the banks are still in crisis. and are still charging people for charges. The HSE is in crisis. Doctors won't wash their hands. Nurses won't wash their hands. They're not doing their job. But they still have their jobs.
I think we have your point.
My name is Sean Joyce, and I live there. I am a Sinn Féin member. But my question is not necessarily about the Shannon itself, it's about democracy in general. And the word is thrown around a lot in the media these days about democracy. And again, it's been mentioned by the panel across the board. But as a young person, democracy, what does that mean to the average politician? Because from what I can see as a young person, as a father, it doesn't mean a whole lot. Because it's okay saying, oh, we'll have elections and one man, one vote, as Richard Bruton keeps saying there. But when you vote for someone, you're handing over your representation. But what if that person doesn't represent if you believe, or the person that did vote for you? What are you going to do when you say one man, one vote, when you don't represent them people?
I'm struggling to grasp your point there.
The panel is on about democracy. What I'm asking, and Richard Bruton quite clearly said several times, one man, one vote. That's the basis of democracy. But if the representation system comes along and the politicians don't represent the people that actually voted for them, why would they keep going on about democracy?
Well, Pierce Downey, I'll let you back that one. Independent voices in Sinn Féin there?
I think it's a very deep. I think we could have a whole session on that, but I think it's down to, it's about going back to the point I was saying earlier on. The reason we're supporting the abolition of the Shannon is because we don't trust those who are saying, particularly the political parties, saying that they are going to reform the Shannon. And it goes, you know, I think there is a big problem in terms of trust. You know, people get the vote and then they break their promises. You have a government that just forgets their manifesto. We've had this debate in the election here. There's a number of parties that have changed their position from manifesto. I think it goes to the core of political reform and the discussion we're having about political reform. We can, as a nation, put forward the best political form that any nation in the world has. We could have the best institutions, but see if you've got individuals, and every one of them is human, see if we're trying to usurp them or change them for our own ways, or trying to limit them, or trying to abuse them for political interest or personal interest or selfish interest, then it's not going to work. So while we need that type of institutional political reform about how we deal with the executive parliament, how we deal with local government, EU and all the rest, there also needs to be a change in mindset. And it's like what the previous lady spoke about. Politics is a dirty game, you know, and there has been huge abuses in the past by politicians in terms of the system. You know, and that's not across the board in every political party. And I've said this in numerous times. I think people get into politics for the right reasons, genuinely do well for their community, for their country. But in the middle of it, it's very easily to be corrupted in politics, and it has been corrupted. And what I was saying earlier on is we do need to earn people's trust, but that needs to be more than just institutional reform. It needs to be a genuine change in people's attitude to politicians themselves and the political parties that they represent.
Thanks. And we have to wrap up this session now, I'm very sorry to say. But before we go, in 30 seconds, could I ask each of you what's going to happen in the Shannon referendum and how big the turnout is going to be on the start of the UBO? What's going to happen?
I think the proposal put forward by the government will be defeated, and I think you will have relatively low turnout.
I think it's going to be defeated as well, and I believe that if the government doesn't take that as a mandate to reform the Shannon, then the people ought not to believe the government's proposals for Dáil reform either, and it's important that we move forward with the mandate for reform.
Hey, Sue, you're an independent voice. What do you think?
I reckon the turnout will probably be about 30%, and the lower it is, the more likely it is it will be defeated.
I think it'll be a very low turnout, worryingly low turnout, and I think the people will take the power back from the politicians and will abolish the Shannon.
Your tone seems to suggest a narrow margin.
I think it's going to. I think for most people out there, it's irrelevant. The people we're talking about, they don't care because the Shannon means nothing to them. It's politicians arguing between themselves, having a go at each other. They're worried about other issues, and they really think that this debate shows that we're kind of disjointed from them a wee bit more as well. So,
final word to Richard Bruton. What's the danger of a bloody nose for Enda Kenny?
Well,
Well, I believe the case for abolition is compelling, and I think it will win, but I mean, I think we have to get the information out, and that's why I certainly am sparing no effort to get around the country and explain why the case is strong.
And you should be looking after jobs.
Lots of strong opinions. Thanks to you, the audience, to Richard Bruton, Piers Carney, James Silver, Senator Councilman Bolt, and Neil O'Brien. Thank you very much.
Just say that in 10 minutes' time, the showing of the film The Kennedys Irish Mafia will commence. So we'd like to stay around and watch this very interesting film by David Harvey. Thank you very much.